Now, buried in these two verses is the essence of that promise. He says in verse 18, I will establish my covenant with you. And a covenant is an agreement between two parties. It's a binding agreement. And God says, I'm going to establish my covenant with you, Noah. My promise is to you to keep you and them alive with you. So when God didn't just tell Noah, hey, here's what I want you to do, it's very important that he communicated it in terms of a promise. He said, I promise you I'm going to keep you alive through what I'm just about to do. And that's very important to our understanding of the story. Okay, so the last part, God's judgment came. And the Lord said to Noah, go into the ark, you and your whole family, because I have found you righteous in this generation. 7 days from now I will send rain on the earth, and 40 days and 40 nights is how long it was going to fall. And I will wipe from the face of the earth every living creature that I made. And Noah did all the Lord commanded him. And Noah and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives entered the ark to escape the waters of the flood. And the Lord shut him in. If you watch a movie about Noah's Ark, there's usually, he's pulling the rope, pull the door up. This was a miraculous miracle event that God supernaturally shut this door. It would have appeared to maybe levitate on its own or whatever, or some force external pushing on it. But from this point on, people outside that saw, they had some evidence that this was something more than just the eccentric old man Noah doing something on his own. They realized at that point, I'm sure, that God was doing this. But at that point, they wouldn't have been able to open the door because God shut it. God can open doors that no man can open, and He'll shut doors that no man. Did I say that right? God can open doors that no man can close, and He shuts doors that no man can open. And after the 7 days, the floodwaters came on the earth, and on that day all the springs of the great deep burst forth, and the floodgates of the heavens were opened. And rain fell on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. I think it's quite interesting, the part in verse 11 where it says the springs of the great deep burst forth. After the earthquake in Japan, there was some video footage shot that's never been taken before. Basically, as the earth is moving and cracks developed up, water actually gushed up out of those cracks. And that's something they found the evidence for. They'd find like lime deposits and stuff on asphalt, but they'd never had it videotaped before. And during the earthquake, they were actually able to videotape that. And the waters rose and increased greatly on the earth, and the ark floated on the surface of the water. They rose greatly on the earth, and all the high mountains under the entire heaven were covered. The waters rose and covered the mountains to a depth of more than 15 cubits, and that translates to about 23 feet or 6.8 meters. So below the surface of the water, 23 feet down, according to the story, was the highest peak on earth, was below water. And every living thing that moved on land perished. Only Noah was left, and those with him in the ark. That's God's judgment. And of course, 23 feet underwater, even the tallest animal standing on his tippy toes, I guess that would be a giraffe, maybe standing on his tippy toes on the top of a mountain, would not be able to stick his little head out of the water. So the story goes. The land became dry again, though. In chapter 7, verse 24, it starts, the waters flooded the earth for 150 days. And skipping into chapter 8. Noah then removed the covering from the ark and saw that the surface of the ground was dry. And by the 27th day of the second month, the earth was completely dry. So from Noah's vantage point, looking out of that narrow opening in the top, he could see some land out there. And given a little bit more time, it was dry around the area of the ship that they would have been able to make an exit. And then God said to Noah, come out of the ark. So Noah came out together with his sons and his wife and his sons' wives, all the animals came out of the ark, one kind after another. God actually made a second promise to Noah in chapter 8, verse 21, starting. Never again will I curse the ground because of humans, even though every inclination of the human heart is evil from childhood. And never again will I destroy all living creatures as I have done. And I have set my rainbow in the clouds, and it will be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. And when we look in the sky and we see a rainbow, a lot of people think of a lot of different things, especially these days, but the original meaning for that rainbow was a reminder of God's covenant that He made with Noah, but moreover with the whole earth. That God is not going to bring destruction on the earth the way that He did in this time. Now, the purpose of our lesson today is not to debate whether the story should be interpreted literally. And there's quite a lot of the story that I took out for the sake of the length of our lesson today. But that's not the purpose of it today. There's a lot that could be said there. But what I'm going to look at, again, we're talking about God's promises, and that's what I want to focus on. And so we're finding significance in the story. And so we're going to take a look at for a minute what it would have meant, what the story would have meant to its original readers, the first people to read the pages of this written story. And then we'll look at what it means to believers today. So for the original readers, we have to answer the question, who are the original readers? And I won't spend much time on this because we've done this for previous lessons. Basically, Moses was probably the author of the first 5 books of the Bible, that is Genesis, where this story is found, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. God was both prophet and historian. He was the one depicted in several of those books, but then there's scripture that said basically God commanded him to write. So he's probably the author. And the first reader of the 5 books of what we today call the Old Testament were the Hebrews of the Exodus. Another story that we won't go into in any great detail, but basically they were the slaves in Egypt whom God delivered supernaturally. And these former slaves would have seen their own experience and their own story in the pages that describe this flood. And let me show you what I mean by that. Noah's flood in a nutshell, well, it's also the Exodus story in a nutshell. God's judgment was imminent. He devised a plan of escape. He communicated His plan to man in the form of a promise, and God's judgment came. Those who believed were saved. In the story of the Exodus, God's judgment was the plagues that came on Egypt. And in particular, the last plague, which was that the firstborn males would die. But God had a plan to save them from that. It was the Passover. God communicated His plan to man in the form of a promise. Well, after that last plague, God had it in mind that He was going to send them to a land flowing with milk and honey. There was promise built into the story. And then when God's judgment came, those who had the stain of blood on their doorposts were saved from that last plague, and they were able to go across the parted Red Sea and then on to the Promised Land. So the people who were in this group of people who were reading this story would have been able to see through their own story. They would have been able to see their own experience in the pages of this story. So we're finding significance in the Noah's flood story. Let's ask for a minute what it means for believers today. What does the story mean for believers today? Well, we have to think about it in terms of future judgment. Now, of course, yesterday was supposed to be Judgment Day, and it's really saddening to me when people claim to be Christians, and I don't doubt his Christian service. It's not my place to judge, and I won't judge. But clearly he had an interpretation of the Scriptures that was not correct. And by putting that prophecy out on the table, there's people who basically would have listened to what he had to say, and then when it turned out that what he had to say was not correct, I'm afraid that the result of that is there's people that are not going to just not attend his church or not believe him anymore, but they're going to turn their minds and close it to Christianity altogether, or to God altogether. One man's interpretations are wrong, but there are still things in the Bible that are supposed to happen. So, when we set the judgment day from yesterday aside, obviously it didn't happen the way that they thought it would happen. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Matthew chapter 24. We'll read several verses from here, but we'll start here with verse 3. As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. "Tell us," they said, "when will this happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" And Jesus answered this question. He said, "Watch out that no one deceives you. But about that day or hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son," speaking of himself, "but only the Father," speaking of God. Only God knows when judgment is going to fall on the earth. Only God knows the timing of what his plan is. So anyone who steps forward and says, "Oh, I know the day or the hour," if they have read this verse, then they're contradicting this verse. This is Jesus' words. He says, no one knows the day or the hour. No one. So if someone says they know, you should probably not give a whole lot of credence to what they have to say, because if they're directly contradicting the Bible and then they're saying, "Oh yeah, I've got this information out of the Bible," there's a contradiction there. So Jesus was warning us. But the disciples asked him, when are these things going to happen? And he didn't just say, "Oh no, they're not going to happen." He said, "This is how it's going to happen." And he laid it out there. And what he said is it was going to be like it was in the days of Noah. Let me read it in verse 37. "As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man." When I started preparing this lesson, actually it was several months ago that I started putting this, the ideas together and so on, and I had no idea about the Judgment Day prediction. So I thought it was somewhat providence that this lesson was supposed to happen on this day after judgment. That was not planned by me. That was not intended by me. But as it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. So we can take the Noah's flood story and the points and the framework of that story, and Jesus says it's going to be that way when the second coming of Christ happens. So we could say that this is also the framework for the second coming. The second coming in a nutshell. Again, God's judgment is imminent. He has devised a plan of escape. He has communicated to man his plan in the form of a promise. God's judgment will come, and those who believe the promise will be saved. So how does this apply to the actual future events that the Bible talks about? Well, God's judgment, just like it was in Egypt, the Bible talks about plagues that are coming. God has a plan. It's to endure to the end. His promise to man is resurrection. And when judgment comes, those who believe the promise will be saved.